Welcome back to the Paddle and Fin Podcast Network. We're brought to you by Yak Gadget for all your fine quality kayak fishing accessories. Go to yakgadget.com. Pelican cases, coolers, and lighting. Go to pelican.com. And the 153 Bait Company for all your hard and soft bait needs. Go to the 153angler.com. So join with me as together we dive into the tips and techniques that will help make us better anglers out on the water. What's going on, everybody? Thanks for tuning back in to the Bass Fishing for Noobs segment here on the Paddle and Fin Podcast. I am your host, Sean Lavery. Tonight, we're going to be talking about jigs, following along on my kind of back to the basics series. I consider kind of a jig kind of a basic starting lure, and something you should, if you can get really good on the jig, it can help you in lots of other ways. And I'm kind of doing this as do as I say, not as I do, because I am not an expert on jigs. I kind of skipped over it because I was super frustrated the few times I tried it. And that's why I really wanted to do a show on it tonight. So to help me learn and get better, I have some of my fellow Paddle and Fin hosts. I have the OG Brian the Killer Schiller and Mr. JP himself from the Off the Water podcast. Let me see if I can add JP.
Whoa, yeah, you better add me in here. What's up, everybody?
Whoa.
What's going on?
So, welcome, guys. My video's a little up there. It goes. It just clicked in. All right, cool. So, thanks for joining me tonight, gents.
Yeah, absolutely, man.
No problem.
I'm ready to be schooled, man. So, jigs, my mortal enemy. I have no luck. You can see here, this is my jig box. It's full. I have no excuse not to catch fish on it. I don't know. So I want to learn. All so right. Where should we start? Okay, so I know. Let's start with types of jigs, because I know there's a kind of jig for lots of different kind of areas. So do you think that's a good place to start?
Sure. The first one you have to do, though, is called the Brian Schiller jig on blue sky.
I should have had that.
Before you learn any other ones, you have to learn the blue sky jig.
You got to know how to dance a jig before you could fish a jig.
Well, if I catch a fish on a jig, I will definitely be dancing a jig.
That's the key to success right there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll start, man. Like, my opinion is, yes, there's tons of different jigs. I think people sometimes overcomplicate it and like overthink it a little too much. I mean, yeah, there are some subtle differences you could do with like the different styles of jigs, but I think if you try to keep it simple, and just work those jigs in the same fashion, you're going to get the same results, with the exception of a swim jig.
Well, and JP actually has a couple of other things that he's going to classify as a jig that I actually have caught fish on, because he's going to talk about bladed jigs. So sure. I've caught chatterbait fish, and he's also going to talk about a Ned rig, and he's calling that a jig too. So
sure, absolutely.
So I've definitely caught fish on that. I'm kind of, when I say I haven't caught fish on a jig, I'm kind of referring to the, the OG original,
like football jig, flipping jig type style stuff. Yeah.
So, right. JP, what do you got?
So, to kind of start us off, the way I look at a jig is kind of the way you look at lure selection and lure size, right? Everyone wants to go, from picking the biggest to the smallest, and there's different styles of variety. But a jig itself, all it is a piece of lead that is attached, lead or tungsten, that is attached to a hook. That is essentially what a jig is in its bare form. When people start adding to it, so when you start talking about skirts, the molding of the heads of the jig, the styles per se, it all comes down to the same thing as classification as jigs. So the way I look at it and I break it down is quite simple. If I'm around, let's say there's two situations: structure and open cover. And when I say open cover, I'm talking about weeds, rocks, anything where fish are going to be hiding or staging in. You start using the variety of jigs. And if when you talk about high to low pressure, and there's some things I want to get into when we talk about style and selection, but typically you're going to be either throwing a football jig or a swim jig in any of these circumstances. When we start going and deriving into other things and specifications, we're going to talk about why those applications work the way they do. I don't know if that makes sense for a good basis, but in my brain, that's how I'm looking at it. And I'll break it down even more.
Okay.
So,
cool. Do you have anything to add to that, Brian?
No, I agree with everything he said.
So one of my big starting off questions is, and I think part of the reason why I struggle is because I feel like when you're throwing a jig, you almost have to know that there's fish in the area. It's not a search bait. Is that kind of, what you guys would say? Because that to me, that's been my biggest frustration is when I throw it, I have no clue. I have no confidence that I'm just going to magically run across a bass.
Yeah, with the exception of a swim jig, I think a swim jig you could, because and obviously, you mentioned the bladed jig or chatterbait, like those are essentially search baits.
Right.
But yeah, I think when you're talking like traditional, like your traditional football jig, something that most folks think of when you speak of jig fishing. I mean, yeah, you got to kind of know there's fish there, for sure. And, like a good scenario is like one day you're crushing them on a swim jig. You go back to that same spot and it's like you can't get a bite on a swim jig. So you slow it down a little bit and you switch to that, flipping jig, football jig, things like that.
yep.
So on and so forth.
Cool.
Yeah. And definitely, we're a lot of times when you're using a jig, you are targeting a known location where that's going to hold fish, whether that's a dock, whether that's a rock that's having breakwater on it on the river, and you're pitching to the backside of it, knowing there's going to be a fish on the other side of that, letting that jig come downstream with a crawl. If you're targeting, and when we talk about Vic mats, if you're punching with jigs that are heavier than an ounce to get down, to get down, they are technique specific until you start adding to them. And like Brian mentioned, like a bladed jig or a chatterbait is a technique specific kind of jig. But for the most part, your down and dirty is going to be targeting areas where fish are known to be holding.
Right. Okay, cool. All right. So we already kind of announced a couple of the types of jigs, but I know, and you said it really depends on your location. So we'll start with what I consider kind of like the standard jig. When I think of a jig, I think of probably a football jig is probably, what I think of as a jig. And I don't know, JP, what picture you have as an example, but a football head jig you can see hopefully there. It has a very wide weight on the end, whether that's tungsten or lead, and it's made, from my understanding, for very rocky environments where this will kind of not go down in those little cracks between the rocks and get stuck as much as some of the other style of heads. Is that kind of the
Yes and no. I mean,
Yeah.
you'll notice on the back side of that head, for those that are watching on like YouTube or Facebook, it's got a flat spot. So that's so that jig stands up. So, I'm sure we'll get into jig trailers and things like that, but typically you want that jig standing up as it's bouncing over those rocks. Or like the one main spot, like I like to throw it to that we didn't mention yet, is like around laydowns where you can't really like get anything else into those tight spots, and you could flip in and really pick apart, trees laying down into the water, things like that too. Running it parallel with like tree trunks is probably one of my favorite things to do, because 9 times out of 10, there's fish just hunkered down underneath that trunk, and as you work that jig by them, they're coming out and just swooping that up,
Okay. And now I also have this one, which is actually a Jig Masters jig.
Yep.
Now, would you consider this a football head jig?
It's very similar. Like he calls that his flipping jig or his
Yeah.
casting jig. Like
Okay.
I fish both the same exact way. Like
That's
I
kind
don't
of what I figured.
yeah, I don't fish those any different. I do like the Jig Masters heads for the instance that they stand up a little bit better. They got more of
Right.
a flatter surface and a wider stance on that head. So, standing up, like, having that jig stand up in the water has always been something I thought was a crucial part to my jig fishing, so to speak. And again, it all depends on what you're fishing around. Like if you're fishing through grass, you might want like a sleeker style head, no flat spots, so that way it's got a nice smooth round head, so it's pulling right through that grass. Whereas like what JP and I were talking about, fishing around rock piles, laydowns, things like that. I think that better suits like that casting jig or a football jig, so to speak.
Okay.
I'm actually, I want to show something that me and Brian, we both got to experience down on Table Rock Lake. And it was actually Brian who had that exact jig you're using.
That
Here
color,
it
yeah.
is. Yeah, so here, let me pull this up on the screen. I just found the picture. Hang on. So
yeah, that was a casting jig in that color pattern that you had in the football. And I forget the name of it off the top of my head. I think it's like Summer Craw 2.0 or something like that from Jig Masters. Candy Craw 2.0. Yeah.
there it is.
And so that's my PB Smalley right there. And I found a rock pile out in like 20 foot of water, I think it was 18, 20 foot of water. And, with my electronics side scanned over it, saw it, and pitched out to it, hopped that jig right over that rock pile, and that Smalley just came and just hammered it. So that's another thing, like deep structure like that, not necessarily like something you would think of. Like, speaking of Table Rock, like there's a lot of flooded timber, like trees under the surface of water, where like you'll cast that jig out, let it sink all the way to the bottom, and run it around those bases of trees. And there's usually some fish around there. A lot of big jagged rock. Love fishing through there, especially if there's like shelves under that rock or like pockets under that rock where fish can hide. And you bring that jig and just let it fall right in front of their face. And like I said, it's just same thing as a laydown, just come out and smack it. And then they'll try to run back underneath that rock. It's kind of like, I relate it to river fishing, right? Like smallmouth typically sit in the seams and they'll come out, grab bait or whatever as it comes by, and then move back into that slack water. Kind of the same theory, like try to fish those spots where it's not necessarily current, but would be like a little hiding spot, where they can come out, grab that bait and move back in.
That makes sense. Go ahead, JP.
You know what? I was actually, and Brian's hitting it on the head. I just want to share this one too. So this actually right here, that's also my PB at Table Rock as well. And what Brian just described is exactly the same way I got this smallmouth, which was on a jig. It was on a jig as well. And you side scanned. I found that rock pile, side scanning, cast it out to that rock pile that was at about 18 to 20 foot of water. And right there, caught him right off of that. And, when we talk about Table Rock and other lakes too, that was a confidence booster for me at that point, because I was kind of intimidated by the actual depth and the perspective of what Table Rock has. So like when they say it's relative to the lake. So when we're catching them 18, 20 foot of water, that's technically shallow for that lake. Guys were catching fish in 15 foot of water on whopper ploppers. I'm like, what?
Wow.
Yeah.
But that lake is so clear, and it goes down for hundreds of feet. And so when you talk about hundreds of feet, because essentially what that lake was a town that got flooded out in order to make a better damming system. And so there's houses, there's trees. I mean, it's like a whole city underwater there.
Yep.
And you know, relative with all those trees, all that provides structure for those fish. So using a jig is essentially one of the most efficient ways to catch fish out of that lake.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing too, right? Efficient due to the fact that, like, you know, a lot of times jigs are heavy. You know, I mean, you got your 3/8 ounce, half ounce, quarter ounce, all the way up to 3/4 and 1 ounce. So when you're talking efficient, a lot of those fish hunker to the bottom, getting down to those depths in a quick amount of time. You know, like I was throwing a half ounce, really could have been throwing a 3/4 or a 1 ounce to get down to those depths faster. However, like I'm a big proponent of the weight is going to change the action of the bait too, in the action of the trailer. Because when you're hopping that, like that's the most common retrieve is hopping it, you know, the jig hopping along the bottom of the water column, or the, you know, whatever your bottom of the body of water you're fishing, is essentially a hop. Sometimes you could do like a slow reel, so it's just like when you got a crawfish pattern on and you see a lot of crayfish like activity, slow reeling it on the bottom like a crayfish swimming away. Like there's a couple different techniques there, but the most common is a hop. So when you're working that bottom and you're on a school of fish, you want to be able to catch one and get back down to it as fast as possible. And I'm talking from like a tournament scenario, but not only that, but like your fun fishing. Usually, like I see it all the time here on my home lake, right? Like I fish a lot of deep lake structure. You catch one, usually that fires the school up, and you cast back out and you'll catch 3, 4, or 5 fish in a row because you're firing that school up, you know, because they saw one freak out over a bait that came through. Now they're sitting there circling like sharks looking for that bait again. So if you're fishing 20 foot of water and you're using a 1/4 ounce jig, it's taking you, you know, probably 3 times as long to get down to the bottom compared to like a half or a 3/4 ounce. So like when we're talking efficiency, I think like that's a key idea to bring up, or a thought process on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, going back to that same tournament we were fishing day one, you know, I was able to pull a good limit, and it was all because those fish, where we had a wind blowing that was blowing into the shore. I was fishing primary and secondary points, and that was blowing whatever bait fish or whatever forage was in that water. But it was a steady drop going down and throwing that jig and craw to the shore and let it fall and work its way down subtly, triggered those fish, and those fish were all school. I got all 5 fish I got were right off that same point, just going back and forth because they were all schooled up there looking for that forage to come in and out. And it happened to be using you know, a jewel jig with a zoom speed craw.
Sure.
Okay. That was the ticket. And essentially that's been my ticket for a lot of my fish there on after. I mean, I have so much confidence in those jigs. If you don't mind, can I pull it up and show what we're talking about?
Yeah.
Because they're a little bit different than the normal jig that's out there.
Okay.
So here, let me share this on the screen.
While you're pulling that up, I think, you know, that is definitely one of the best lessons I've learned, you know, that kind of transformed my fishing, is always make another cast in after you catch a fish. Now, when I first started, you know, I'd be so happy that I caught a fish and I'd be so excited. Oh my gosh, I got a fish. And I'd forget all about throwing back in there and trying again until I was past the spot or whatever. But But yeah, definitely, once you catch a fish, make note of where you caught it, kind of what you were doing, and go right back and see, because like you're right, 9 times out of 10, if there's one there, there's bound to be another one there more often than not. So
For sure, for sure. Yeah, especially when you're jig fishing too. But it depends as well. Like those deep rock piles, like you would get fish schooled up. If you're fishing a laydown, yeah, you might have like one or two tucked up underneath a log. It all depends, depends how big that tree is or log or whatever in the water. But I would always primarily focus on like something structure for, say, when we're talking football, flipping jigs, things like that.
So this jig right here is the Jewel jig. This is their Finesse jig. So what makes this kind of stand out from other jigs that are out there is that it is essentially a football jig. The skirt's brought up further on it, but however, the way the head is designed, it has it's rounded, but then it's kind of punched out a little bit, and it gives it a very unique fall. It actually seems to slow the fall down a little bit more, but it's causing more. What that essentially is doing is causing more action with your trailer, and that's the next thing we're going to get talking to is trailer presentation and techniques as well with the trailer selection with these jigs. But you know what? When you talk about it, it has the versatility of a football jig with the action of a swim jig. And I never knew about this jig until I was doing my research for Table Rock. These guys are based out of the Ozarks, based in Arkansas, and kind of primarily they keep to like the Bull Shoals, Table Rock, Lake of the Ozarks, that area. So they're exclusive to that area, but it's this jig is the way it fishes and the way it works. It's my favorite jig in the entire world, and I if anybody asked me which one would I give you, this is what I would give you in a heartbeat. It's kind of the all around go to for having all techniques together.
interesting. I have one that's very similar to that. It's actually a 6 Sense Finesse Jig.
Yep.
I don't know if you guys can see that. This one, what makes this one weird is it has the screw lock on the hook of the jig.
Yep.
But so again, I have no excuse for not catching them because I have about every kind there is. But yeah, I haven't even thrown this one yet. I've had it. Most of my jigs have never seen the outside of my jig box, sadly.
So if we're talking finesse jigs, this is like one of my favorite go-tos. This is the Kaitek Tungsten football jig. Okay. And this is a very small finesse jig. And because it's tungsten weight, it's very small and compact. So like, when you want to slim down your profile when the bite is tough, tie one of these on with like a TRD craw and get ready because it's about to be Chomp City.
Yeah.
Jig Masters also has a finesse jig.
Yeah, their finesse jig is cool too. I like it.
It has, what makes it unique is it has like a kind of, the screw lock is almost
off the head of the,
but in line with the hook too. So
yeah,
you can almost Texas rig your bait. It doesn't have a weed guard, but you can Texas rig it, which basically does that for you. So
heck yeah. Yeah, I like that jig, man. Those things are super sexy.
Now, we're talking about the styles of jigs and things that are going on. And obviously, I think we just, for our listeners, making the distinguishment, we're talking about finesse jigs, we're talking about swim jigs and football jigs. I think we have a basis in understanding a football jig versus a swim jig versus a finesse jig. Agreed, Sean?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. Yep.
So I think now we can move on and talk about the other factor to this which is just as big as selecting jig, but is selecting the proper trailer to go with these jigs. So I'm a big proponent. I love the Zoom Speed Cross. I think those have some of the best action in the claws themselves. When they're going down, they move back and forth. give it, a displacement of water when they're going down.
Okay.
But that's just the way they're designed. They're designed inward versus other trailers out there are more out or flat, which gives it a different action presentation. I just have a preference for those, but there's a million, just like us fishermen and the fish, there's a million different products out there to lure us to what kind of trailers we want to put on the back of our rigs.
Yeah, I
Right.
mean, I'm a big proponent with like playing with different jig trailers and jig trailer options. Like my favorite go-to with like a standard half-ounce football jig is a Berkeley chigger craw.
Mhm.
It's just something that's always been successful for me. And it's not very much different than the Zoom. I've used the Zoom too. I've used um, the Z-Man Turbo Craws as well.
Yep.
Um, just as good. I mean, they're all kind of similar in their own fashion. But what you could also do is, and what I've done numerous times is like use small creature baits as well, and put those on. I know guys that'll use swim baits as trailers,
Okay.
Yep.
especially like on a swim jig, of course, but I'm talking on a football jig or a small finesse jig. I know a couple guys that'll use like paddle tails as trailers too, like
Okay.
something different to think about, especially like if you got a shad spawn or something like that going on. You might want to do that versus using a craw or a creature style trailer. That's always a thought. And not only that too, but like a basic twister tail, a worm,
Hmm.
like a cut tail worm, something like
Okay.
that. Like if you want a slimmer profile, like we were talking about, like a casting jig with a slimmer head and pulling it through grass, you may want to put like a 4 or 5 inch finesse worm on there. Like that's the thing too. I think there's no right or wrong way, but there's a ton of different options and that's what makes jig fishing cool to me, is like you could do it so many different ways. And
Absolutely.
like crayfish may work one day, a paddle tail may work the next day, and you're like,
Yep.
why can't I just
There's
figure
no
out like
rhyme or
one way to
reason.
do it? Yeah, right. Like, it's just one of those things. But I think like the big thing is I thought about this leading up to tonight. I was thinking about a couple things like I wanted to mention, like tips and tricks that I do. Like when I fish that chigger craw, right, and I'm fishing it, and say get bit, and I come back and a claw is missing. Okay, well those fish are short striking that jig. They're just grabbing the claw.
Yep.
So what you may want to do is trim that craw down a little bit so it gets further down on the hook head, and
Hmm.
then trim your skirt as well, so you still have that same profile. Like you're still keeping the same profile, but you're bringing everything closer to that hook. And 9 times out of 10, that'll help you get hookups rather than them just ripping your claws apart. And you're like, I just went through 3 bags of trailers and didn't catch a single fish. Something to think about, like if you're getting short strikes like that, is trim that down, trim the skirt down, things like that. That could be the difference of hooking into fish versus just continually missing them and like pulling your hair out. Like it took me a long time to like realize like what was going on and what to do to adjust to make that hookup ratio better rather than losing fish.
That was going to be one of my questions: is how often do you trim? Like I've heard all sorts of things. Like you want to trim the skirt to like right below where the hook is, so that my hook point is right there. So some people would say trim right to the base of the hook. And I've also heard about trimming the weed guard until it's kind of right, kind of where the hook hits it. So I wasn't sure how much you guys do that, like right off the bat, or you wait and see what's happening first before you make those kind of adjustments.
I have a
Very,
tendency to
very,
wait and see.
yeah, yeah. I'll generally wait till I get a bite. If I do trim my weed guard, and I'll give credit to G-Man for this, um, Gerald Swindle. What he does is he'll cut it. So if you hold that back up, Sean, that jig with
Mhm.
the weed guard. So if you cut at an angle, the weed guard at an angle, going up away from the hook. So you kind of have it at an angle. That helps a little bit. And it still protects your hook. But what I like to do is I like to grab that brush guard and kind of flatten it out. Like
Yeah.
instead of like how it's round, I'll kind of like stretch it and flatten it out so it's a little bit wider sometimes too. Like when you're going through real weedy cover, that sometimes helps. Like just trying to kind of flatten that out, and I'll push it all the way down to the base of the hook, and so it's bended back towards that hook a little bit more instead of sticking straight up.
Right.
I find that helps as well.
Okay.
As far as like trimming, like JP said, like I'll usually wait. Like my rule of thumb is like I'll trim my trailer before I trim my skirt.
Yeah.
Like I like to have it so like when I have a chigger craw on a 1/2 ounce jig, I usually like it so like the arm of the craws is starting right at the edge of the skirt or maybe just inside that skirt. So
Okay.
that way it like the skirt isn't holding up the action of that arm flapping in the water column, so to speak. But sometimes like it depends. Like if you get a 3-inch versus a 4-inch chigger craw, like I've noticed sometimes I can only find 4-inch. So usually what I do is on the body of the actual chigger craw, there's like ribs, and I'll cut at the first rib or the second rib to bring it in a little bit.
Mhm.
I know the Zoom speed crawls are the same, right? JP, they're like ribbed on the back of the body.
They are, and there's two different sizes as well. There's the mag UVs, and then there's the regular size ones as well.
Sure.
And
But yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. But I mean, again, when you're talking about sizing, I kind of look at I just by marketing, I started noticing a pattern here, and the pattern that I've noticed is if you buy any jig that's between, I would say, give it the 3/8 to about a 5/8 ounce jig. So your 3/8, your 1/2, and your 5/8. You're tending to go with anywhere between a 3 and a 4-inch trailer. If you're
Okay.
going anything higher than that, you're going with the mag size or the bigger trailers that me and Brian, the mag or the 4-inch chigger craw to fit those bigger jigs. Just marketing wise, I've seen those two paired. That's how like pairing together without really having to make adjustments, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I always used to be a guy like, why would I cut up a perfectly good plastic? Like, I don't think you need to be afraid of like, you could just get all 4-inch and just trim
Yeah.
them down to like suit your needs. Like, I mean, it's funny. Like when I fish a shaky head, I use the Zoom trick worms a lot. First thing I do is I bite like the first 2 or 3 ribs off, so it gives it a flat surface to put in my screw lock instead
Yep.
of having that rounded head. Like
Mhm.
doesn't make a difference. I haven't caught less fish or more fish because of it. So I mean, don't be afraid to like trim down that plastic to get it to the exact size you need so it fits on that hook and it has just a nice, good presentation look when it's all put together with your jig.
Yeah, I was gonna say I've used like these creature style baits. Like this
Yeah.
is a 153 bait, but I'll cut this off at maybe the second or third rib from the top because otherwise it's a pretty long trailer and it'll stick out pretty far. But you can see that's what's on this. So I have it coming out like kind of like you said, where the claws are just past where the skirt comes out.
Yep.
So
Yep. That's perfect,
uh,
man.
Yep.
yep.
You're doing it
So
right. And it's funny because actually I want to kind of point something out, and you should hold that back up real quick.
okay.
So we're talking about the trailers and selection, and we're talking about in the water the technique or the presentation, I should say. So like with those style prawns right there, or the claws. So you're gonna have like a flutter when those are going down, right? That
Hmm.
bait's going down. That's gonna be going like this when it's going back and forth, going down, and then when it's standing up, it's gonna kick back and forth like this. All right.
Okay.
Now
Yep.
I'm gonna share my screen real quick again because I want to show just so people could understand. When we talk about trailer selection and understanding playing around with different trailers and how much of important impact this makes. So like here, this is the Zoom speed crawl right here. So if you can see how the claws themselves are brought on the inside, these are now fluttering on the inside when they're going down. So you're getting more action on the inside, and then when it's standing up, it's actually drawing and because if you look at it on the bottom, it's making almost like a bubble come up from those claws after you're moving around because the way they're turned in. Just something to think about when you're attaching them to your trailers and when you're selecting, what you would like. Different styles create different actions in the water.
Yeah, and I think with those claws curled in a little bit too, like when you swim that, it almost gives those claws like a twister tail effect, where it kind of
Yeah.
swirls a little bit. So that's the thing too, right? Like when we talked about sometimes they want a lot of action, sometimes they don't want as much action, and sometimes they want very little action. So that's why it pays to you could have 3 jigs, but 10 different trailers with you, and it's good to have that just because you just don't know what the fish are going to be kind of keened in on that day. One thing I'll share real quick too that I got pulled up, the creature bait I like to play with a lot is the Strike King Rage Bug. So that's a nice little trailer, and that's what I actually caught that big smallmouth on, was one of these Rage Bug trailers on that Jig Masters flipping jig down there on Table Rock. So
You mean the thing that comes out the predator's mouth when he opens up and goes,
yeah, pretty much.
So
I've used a bunch of different ones. I've had the D-bomb for missile baits.
Yeah, that's a good one.
That's this one.
Yep.
So again, it looks similar to the 153 baits, but yeah.
And
JP,
I'm probably gonna
Go
have the unpopular opinion in the room right now. But when we're talking about trailers, and I think about swim jigging and interchanging stuff, I've always been a kind of stick to one, stick to another kind of guy. So when I think of a either a finesse or a stand-up jig head, I'm thinking crawfish, right? Because
Sure.
that's where that's going to be. When I think of a swim jig, and plus the way they're marketed too, I'm thinking that's where the pad tail. I'm going to put a pad tail on a swim jig because you're mimicking a fish. Particularly, a lot of the market tends to make a bluegill. You'll see, man. This year, I have not seen more art. Like Bassmasters had an article, and Fisherman had an article about creating a swim jig that mimics a bluegill, because
Sure.
you're throwing that swim jig around beds. And what happens once the bass are done spawning, the bluegills move up, and that's the time you want to throw that kind of jig. So for anybody listening, be as creative as you want. I kind of stick to the bread and butter. A craw style goes onto a flathead or stand up jig head versus a swim bait goes to the swim jig. Just kind of the way I kind of keep it simple and streamlined like that.
And I was just going to say, and I know we want to talk about retrieves a little bit, and you kind of talked about the retrieve of a swim jig. I want to cover that because it's not just chuck and wind for the most part. But
No.
when I was going to say that I think it's a really good bluegill imitator, because when you stop that swim jig and the skirt flares out, you're getting that wider profile that a bluegill will put off versus like a shiner or something smaller. And so that's why I think a swim jig in particular is a very good bluegill imitator for a bait wise.
Yeah, and
Totally
with
agree.
the swim jig, yeah, and Sean, we'll cross that bridge into the other thing we were talking about before the show. But with that Swinjig, when I'm throwing it, I'm a very visual person, so I like to visualize what that lure is doing in the water, right? So if I think it's going to mimic a bluegill, I want to make the action of what a bluegill would be doing. When I look down at the water and I see bluegill swim around, what do I see them doing? They're kind of hanging out, then they scurry. They hang out, then they scurry. So when I'm doing this retrieve, I'm giving it a pause, reel, let it pause, kind of sit around, reel, enough to get those bass aggravated because it's stopping going. Hey, it's stopping, it's picking at the bed, or it's in my area, looking around. I want that as a bass, I want that out of there. So when I think about how that lure is, I'm trying to picture myself as the fish, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. I think that's definitely something that also was a learning experience for me is imagining what that lure is doing down there, and when it's a crawl imitation and you're counting rocks, as they say, kind of just popping it along the bottom, up over a rock and down the other side, and that hopping technique. I think the biggest thing for me for that was actually getting rods that were sensitive enough that I could kind of figure out what I was doing, because when I first started out, the rods I had weren't sensitive enough, so it just felt spongy. Everything down there, I couldn't tell what I was on, what kind of bottom it was, what I was bumping, and as I upgraded my rods a little bit, it was kind of amazing. Like a light bulb went off and I was like, oh, that's what they're talking about. Okay. So I think that's a big deal, knowing, or at least imagining what your bait is doing at the other end of the line. So
yeah.
Boom. Yeah, I like doing during a shad spawn, I like doing a slow reel with a few twitches in there as you're reeling, just to mimic like an injured shad or something like that. Like that's a good retrieve too when you're in that kind of situation, shad spawn, something like that.
Well, while we're on that subject, you want to talk about retrieves? So one of the ones that JP mentioned was the Swinjig Retrieve, and that was one that I had hardly ever played with. I've at least thrown the standard jig, like the football style jig, so I kind of knew about like a hopping retrieve for that. I've kind of seen that done on tactical bass and stuff, and what the bite looks like. It kind of the bass will like see it hop, it'll kind of go right down to it. If it hops again, it'll follow it a little bit and then just.
Yep.
And so the bite is more of just a little, not necessarily a hammer or.
Well, it depends. Like sometimes you'll feel that bite like super aggressive, especially like in the spring, like pre, during, and just right after the spawn. Like I think that bite is typically usually pretty aggressive. Like summertime, like deep structure, things like that. A lot of times you'll go to hop and you feel it heavy and you just got to lay back into it and set the hook. And like my recommendation for that too, like I talk about it like when I fish a shaky head too, because it's kind of the same kind of thing is like, sometimes they'll aggressively hit it where you'll feel it. But other times, like I said, you'll go to lift up, it'll feel heavy. Hook sets are free, man. Just lay into it no matter what it is, if it's weeds, whatever. Like I've seen so many people, including myself, miss fish just because you're like, it's a weed, and then next thing you know, it's swimming off, and then you pull it right out of its mouth, whereas you could have just set into it. So same thing on a jig, man. Just if it feels heavy, it could be that the head's stuck in a rock or something like that. Just set it. You're better off.
Right. No, that's definitely good advice too. Hook sets are free, so until you really get the feel of what a hit feels like and everything, definitely lay into them and figure it out later. So
another thing too, when we're talking about retrieves, and I've learned this over the course of years. Actually, a buddy of mine, Chris Quinn, who fishes Table Rock quite frequently. He's here in Illinois, another Chicago fireman, but he's there's a members only lake. It's not an OnlyFans, so sorry guys, but it's a members only. It's a members only lake, which was another quarry, which is just super deep. And, and I learned this from him and I apply it, and it does make sense. So when you're fishing deeper and you're doing a retrieve, I mean, deeper is relative, right? When we talk about waters, what's deep to it. But nonetheless, you want to make your cast, right? You want your lure to fall. You want that presentation to fall, because I would say 50% of the time, those fish are going to watch it fall and strike on that fall, especially in deeper water, because they're sitting there. If you know that this is a target area fish, it's going to drop. Now, let's say it doesn't hit on the drop. Slowly start reeling it, because when you start going more, if you start putting more hopping, or if you're reeling it and then if you're burning it and you're trying to go like this with it, you are actually you're making it look way less natural, and you're gonna tend to not get bites, because this is something that's thrown this fish off. And if you're burning it while you're doing that, you're just pulling it away further and further. Fish tend to be lethargic at times, and we could go into about the whole feeding cycle, whatever. Most of the time, the strikes you're going to get are reaction strikes. And if you're burning along, making it very irritating, they're not going to bother with it. But if you're actually throwing it out, let it fall, and then nice, steady retrieve with a pop here, a pop there, reel, give it a pop. Now it looks more natural, because you're already doing a lot just by reeling that line underwater. It's already making disturbance going off the bottom. So, slow down. You don't have to burn it back. Let the lure do the work itself for you. So I'd offer that up in retrieve technique as well.
I think it was Paszkowski. I was watching a video he did on jigs in preparation for this, and one of the things that he said quite a few times, I believe, is if you think you're fishing a jig too slow, slow down.
Slow down.
Yep.
Yeah. And that was another one of the things that definitely at first I'm 100% positive I was working it way too much, moving it way too fast. So now learning the Ned rig kind of helped me, learn what slow is. So I think the next time I throw it, I feel like I'm going to be able to put this together. But that's definitely one of the things you want to make sure you're going slow and feeling everything that bait is doing.
And that's another thing too, like on a Ned rig, sometimes you do that slow drag. You could do that with a half-ounce football jig too on rock, or even sand is good too, because what it'll do is it'll disturb that, kind of catch the attention. But that slow drag too, like, it's kind of similar in Ned rig, but it's a little bit heavier, where especially if you're dragging across rock or gravel or something like that, that lead head or tungsten head is going to make a really loud ticking noise, which is going to draw attention to the fish and kind of give it that realistic sound of a crayfish, dancing across, gravel or rock. So it's not a bad idea to like intermix like a slow drag, hop, 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 slow drag, hop, hop, slow drag, hop, 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 like change it up, because bass are finicky. We know that, like, one day it could be working one way it could be working another. Sometimes combine the two on your retrieve and say, okay, I caught this fish on a drag. Next fish, I caught it on a drag again. Okay, well, I'm just going to keep dragging that jig and forget about the hops, or vice versa. Caught it when I was hopping the jig, didn't get anything while I was dragging it. So you can kind of combine the two and kind of see what reaction is getting bit out of those fish, versus the other, so to speak.
There's another technique, and you had mentioned tactical bass, and Matt Allen, he said himself, when you're fishing the Ned rig itself, what you want to do is, and I think Brian, he used that same quote, hook sets are free. So you throw it out there and you literally pop, reel, pop, reel. Goes, and until you feel something heavy on that line, set the hook. Whether it's weeds or a fish, It's going to be one or the other while you're fishing that Ned rig. And absolutely true. I mean, if you go on my Instagram and my pages, couple of the biggest fish I have come off Ned rigs too. And and again, we classify Ned rig as a jig because essentially, what's a jig? It's a piece of tungsten or lead with a hook attached in it. This is a very finesse style stand-up jig head. Your purpose is to have that bait stand up on the bottom, and Z-Man with their pattern, gives it that buoyancy, so it's always standing up because of the Elastec. And I mean, you can't beat it. It's smallmouth candy, largemouth love it too. When when the bite gets tough, go to the Ned rig. And one thing I wanted to show you guys too, and we were talking about swim jigs, and this was answering your question earlier, Sean. I'm going to share the screen, but what I would also put in the swim jig category that's also a swim bait is the almighty, the one and only Dark Sleeper. So for those who don't know, this is the Dark Sleeper here, and I would categorize this as a swim jig. Why? There's a swim bait style head in there with a pad tail body. It's just designed differently, with the hook being covered by the dorsal fins, but the action and the techniques are the same when you're retrieving this. You're going to be. I fished it this weekend, and the same thing. You're going to be what's a goby doing while it's down in the water? It's fishing. It's going around and it's trying to eat whatever's on the bottom there. And what's it doing? It's pissing off the fish because it's in that area. What are you going to do? You're going to reel it. You're going to pop it, reel it, pop it. And you're going to start getting those fish aggravated. And when those fish get aggravated, they take that bait. And I mean, when Brian, you were there, Madison, aside from the topwater bites that I had, my two biggest fish for that day, one got big fish and one got me up into fourth place. That was all on the Dark Sleeper. And it was just doing that same thing, just popping it till those fish got aggravated, just like you would a swim jig.
Interesting. He's giving all the juice away, man.
You need to close your mouth, JP.
Hey, this is for the noobs.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding. I just recently got into the Dark Sleeper, and I saw my buddy this past weekend doing the same thing you're talking about, like a jigging motion as he was bringing that Dark Sleeper in, and he caught a couple nice fish. And I was running the shaky head. I was catching fish. He tossed that on, and he was catching the same amount of fish. I was hooking fish in the lip. These fish were choking that thing.
Yep.
Which was crazy. I was like, I need to fish this. I know I have one. Like, I need to dig it out. And I actually was at Cabela's or Bass Pro this week, and I picked up 2 more when I was there. So yeah, that's on my to-do list when I get back out on the water, is start fishing that Dark Sleeper a little bit.
They're fun, man. They are fun. And you know what? It's funny because the whole reason why they're choked is the way that hook is. So they're literally coming up behind it, inhaling it, and you're sending that hook while it's in there. You're not waiting for it to do the bump bump. Once you feel, you feel it right away. And another tip with it, do not. I would say I prefer doing more of a side sweep than a straight up hook set, because I feel like I've lost fish too going straight up trying to hook set, because now you're pulling it further away versus doing a side sweep and you're getting that hook up because the way it's positioned in there. Just something I noticed while doing hook sets with the Dark Sleeper.
Gotcha.
Interesting. Yep. All right. Well, so we've covered the different types. We've covered retrieves. I want to talk a little bit about hardware, like what you're throwing it on, because I think that also is going to make a big difference. So what kind of rods, what kind of line?
Yeah. For the most part, everything I'm doing is with fluorocarbon. I'm using at least minimum 12-pound test. I'll sometimes go up to 15-pound test on a baitcaster. And I'm using a medium heavy fast action power rod when I'm throwing these jigs. Medium heavy powers in the butt, but the sensitivity's in the tip. And then
that's what she said.
But
hey, this just turned into an after-hour show.
It sure did. But another thing to know too is retrieve wise, I use a 6-to-1 gear ratio on my reels when I'm using those.
Okay,
I'm way different than you, man.
I was gonna say I had a feeling that we were gonna have some differing opinions on this one. So
no, I mean like when I'm doing finesse jigs or swim jigs, I'll do the medium heavy fast action tip. I'm usually like, and it depends on water clarity, but most of the time I'm using 12-pound fluoro clear by P-Line. And then when I'm doing like a football jig, flipping jig, and that half ounce or more, I'm usually using like 17 to 20-pound fluorocarbon. I like to use the P-Line tactical fluoro, I think it's called. Just because you're usually around structure or rocks or something. So you're around stuff that's going to braid that line a lot easier. So you want a thicker line. Like the only way I would go down in line is if it was crystal clear water, like Table Rock. But even still, I think when I was fishing that, I was probably using 17-pound test deep,
Yeah, I had 15 for that one.
Yeah, but I like especially in the spring, pre-spawn, during the spawn, and post-spawn, like if I'm fishing some real gnarly rocky stuff, I'm definitely like 17 to 20-pound fluoro clear or fluorocarbon, straight fluorocarbon. That tactical stuff that P-Line makes is nice and rigid. And I'll flip into there. If it's like dirty water, you could definitely get away with like throwing braid. But I like that fluorocarbon a little bit better. And then when I'm throwing that half ounce or more, I'm going to a heavy rod, fast action tip, or a heavier rod. And I'm usually like with the finesse stuff, I usually like a 7.2 on the rod. And then on that heavier stuff, I'm like 7.4 to a 7.6, 7'6" rod. Just so that way you got a little bit more leverage. Because that's the thing too, is those hook sets on a jig are usually pretty stout. So, you got to really drive that hook home. So having that little bit more of a backbone on the rod is sometimes better. And then I'm using either 7.3 to 1 or 8.1 to 1 reel speeds. Just because like my theory on that is like, especially when you're flipping, you're usually only like working a little bit of ground. Then you want to get it back to the boat as fast as possible, flip it back out there. Or once you got it hooked, you want to get it into the boat as fast as possible as well. Most of that action isn't while you're reeling. It's the action that you're giving it through the rod. So, reel speed allows you to reel up that slack real quick, especially like we were talking about earlier, like bringing it over big drops or ledges or, big chunk rock like that, being able to get that slack up so you're not missing that bite when they're hitting it on that downfall. There's a lot of times those fish will hit when that jig, like especially when you're bouncing, they'll hit it on the downfall or while it's just sitting there, in my experience. So a little bit faster reel for me. I don't think there's no right or wrong way. That's just like the reason why I use those gear ratios.
I think it's worth mentioning too, and Brian mentioned, I also have one setup that's a heavy action, or I'm sorry, heavy fast action that I use for when we talk about fishing mats and punching with heavier jigs, and I actually use that with a braid to floral leader, but I wind up using 65-pound braid on that baitcaster because you really, like Brian said, it's not about the the speed that you're using that, to retrieve that lure. It's about how fast you need to get that fish out, because when you're in the thick of it, that braid cuts through, and if you have a faster gear ratio, that's going to pull that fish faster as well. So I do use that in that same sense as well.
And it's the same thing too, and like that's part of the reason why I use the heavier line, a faster reel, and a more rigid rod on like a 1/2 ounce to 3/4 1 ounce jig, especially when I'm fishing laydowns, is because there's probably a million branches down there, and you want to get that fish out of that as quick as possible without allowing them to swim back down into that stuff and get hung up, and then essentially get knocked off, or you lose the fish or break off or whatever. Like that's another key reason too. You want to be able to like almost set the hook, like where you set the hook and the fish comes flying out of the water in your boat. Like that's what you want to achieve. Like get it out of that crap as soon as possible.
Yep.
So having that backbone and being able to lean into that fish and control that fish a little bit more to get it back to the boat can sometimes be essential.
And like you said, I think another part of that is a lot of jigs tend to have those bigger, stouter hooks. And so to drive that hook point through, you're going to want a little bit more oomph behind it,
Mm-hmm.
Now, Jig Masters does have he has a series of light wire jigs that maybe work a little bit more like I would say a Ned rig almost, where you're kind of digging that in there that way. Like I want to say skin hook, but that's not the right word for it.
Yeah, I know he brought the light wire on for the kayak guys, and essentially like you're not planted as much as you are in a boat. So like you got more movement, like, or being drug around, so to speak. So it allows that hook to penetrate a lot better than a stouter hook, so to speak, when you're in a kayak. That was kind of the thought process behind that. So you didn't have to lean way back. Like, for the instance, you're sitting down, a lot of kayak guys are sitting down while they're fishing, you know, um, you can't necessarily snap or lean back into that fish as much as you could if you were standing on the deck of a boat. So that light wire hook definitely helps with that. But there's points in time where you want that heavier hook. So it's one of those things you got to kind of play with it a little bit and kind of see what suits your needs. I've used both. I haven't seen a huge difference personally, but that's me and the way I fish jigs. But it's worth experimenting and seeing which works better for you, so to speak, out of a kayak.
Right on. Cool. All right. Well, we hit the hour mark. Nice job, gents. Anything else I was going to say? Like, what did we miss? Anything?
I got two things, but they're very, very small.
Okay.
And one's smaller than the other. But I just want to emphasize that when we talk about
that's what she
jigs,
said.
I was waiting for that.
So when we talk about hook, line, and sinker, baby. When we talk about jigs, we got to also. It's worth mentioning that the chatterbait or the jackhammer is also considered essentially it's a jig. It does the same thing, but with the blade, you can fish it in the technique of a consistent retrieve. However, there's no rules that say you can't jig, because I've caught fish throwing the chatterbait out and just jigging it and letting that flutter go up with the blade and then let it flutter down and doing the same thing. Essentially it's the same technique with just the blade on it.
I remember last year when we did the paddle and fin tournament, watching Brian do that, and he was kind of, not saying what he was doing, but I'm like, wait, you said you had a chatterbait tied on, but you're jigging that, and you're like, shh, But
no, I like that yo-yo, and when you're retrieving it, just like a rip, reel in the slack, rip it, reel in the slack, and 9 times out of 10 they're hitting it on that deadfall. Especially during the spawn. Like I've got a ton of bites, like especially in dirty water where you can't see the beds, and just ripping it and yo-yoing it across those beds like that it just irritates those fish, and they just come up and hammer it.
Yeah, and when we talk about that too, so like, so a jig, and when we talk about clear water, a lot of times jigs, clear water, they work for the fact that the fish are visually seeing that jig, right? But when it comes to dirty water, you're going to be using a bigger size jig, or like Brian just mentioned, the yo-yoing, because fish fill with their lateral lines. So if it's dirty water or stained water, whatever the case, and you're creating that vibration, that water disturbance, they're going to feel that before they see it, but it's going to aggravate them and initiate a strike.
Yeah, totally.
And
What was
I'm
your
guessing-
second thing?
the last thing worth mentioning is let me share this. Let's go back to our roots as children, and what we like to go even more finesse than the Ned rig is this guy right here, the old trusty crappie style jig heads. And we talk about it, but those don't. If you're having a hard time, a Mr. Twister tail and a jig like this will get you bass, and you won't believe how many bass you will catch, even big bass, because when you had to downsize and finesse that presentation, this is the ultimate finesse. It's different from the net because you're using more of a swimming technique and jigging up and down, because the nets are standing straight up, but this is meant to keep that tail floating throughout the water column. It's deadly bait,
especially in a river situation as well.
Yep.
I was just gonna say, when we interviewed Bill Schultz, I think the Smalley monster, man, he loves curly tail grub on a ball head jig, and he said it's one of his best baits for smallmouth for sure. So
nice. I'll leave you with this. This is my last thing, and this is the most epic jig fishing story ever. And I have witness to this. We were on Cowan Lake in Ohio for a paddle and fin meetup. It was myself, Jay Randall, and Josh Eldridge. Josh struggled all day to get a bite. I was fishing a jig. I turned Jay on to jig fishing at that event. Like, he's like, man, I got jigs. I never fish them. Kind of the same thing you're talking about, Sean. I don't really know how to fish them, this and that, blah, 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 blah. So I was running them through how to fish it. Offered Josh the same thing. Josh was struggling, man. It was hot as all get out. It was 4th of July weekend, and we're pre-fishing the day before the event, and I've caught like 6 or 7 fish. Jay's caught 3 or 4. Eldridge 0. And we came back into this cut in the lake, and there was a ton of timber on the bottom of the lake, like logs, bushes, things like that. So essentially what I was doing is casting the jig out, hopping the jig over those logs, and I would get smacked. And I had just recently caught a fish as we were going back into this new little cove, and Jay Randall was right next to me, and I said, watch this. I said, I'm going to catch a fish from under Josh's boat. And Josh heard me say it. I casted my jig, and it was so close to the side of his boat. When it hit the water splashed up and hit Josh's elbow. I twitched it twice, and I looked at Randall, and I set the hook, and I caught a fish from under his boat. And that was the day Josh Eldridge quit kayak fishing for a day. He was just done. So that is my epic jig fishing story. Catch it. Nice. If you're ever fishing with Josh Eldridge, just fish under his boat. That's where the fish are.
Nice.
Well,
some takeaways for me that I didn't necessarily think of before when I thought of jig fishing is when you guys are talking of fishing at depth. I always kind of pictured a jig as like the flipping kind of 5 foot, you're flipping in and pulling it back out. I didn't even think to try it on those 20-foot deep drop piles, but
sure.
Now that's definitely going to be an application where I try it. And I think what I'm looking forward to trying the most is the lake closest to me, that's 15 miles away, has one whole stretch of shoreline that's riprap that goes from 2 foot, 5 foot, 10 foot, 15 foot. Like, so I think if I just sit parallel to that riprap and just hop it down that ledge, those different depths, I think that's gonna be a good application. So
what I like doing in that scenario, whether it be a jig or a different kind of bait, like I know what you're talking about. Rip wrap, it's like a drop. It's almost like a dam, right? Because I got that same situation here in my home lake. So one of the favorite things I like to do is almost hit it at a diagonal, so you got a longer retrieve. And then when you actually get hit, make mental note of like the depth area, and then move into that depth area and then parallel the bank in that depth area. Because if you're paralleling it and you're only paralleling it up shallow, like in the fish are, in 8 foot of water, you're not going to get bit necessarily. So like, that's what I like to do in many different scenarios like that, is just kind of figure out what depth they're at first and then parallel and work that depth nonstop. But what I will say is, like, in the evening or first thing in the morning, more than likely those fish are going to be real tight, shallow, because they're pushing bait fish or whatever their forage is up against those rocks, and they'll be right up there. So like, I've gone early in the morning, flip right as close as I can to the bank, 2 hops off, and bam, you're getting hit. Like, that's a good spot to definitely go, like, try your jig fishing out.
Right. No, and I meant perpendicular. As I said parallel, but I meant perpendicular. So,
well, you're not wrong by parallel. Like, I would start kind of perpendicular or at like a 45-degree angle, kind of figure out that depth, and then work that bank parallel in that water column where those fish are kind of staged up, is what I was kind of getting at.
No, that makes sense. Yep. No, and that makes sense too, because that's kind of where I first had luck with the wacky rig is, up shallow first thing in the morning. And that makes sense why that worked for me there, because that's where they were,
Sure.
Once that bite would shut off, then I'd struggle because.
So when that bite shuts off, then pull out your jig and start fishing it deeper. Like, more than likely those fish are still there. They just drop down in the water column. Like, that's always a good rule of thumb, and like something I always try out every time I go out fishing. Like, first thing in the morning or last hour of light, like, I'll fish the bank pretty hard. And then right after that or right before that, I'll work that deeper edge, with your jig, your shaky head, like something closer to the bottom, sometimes a swim bait, things like that. And then as it like progresses into the evening, those fish will move up, or, vice versa.
Right. Cool.
I'll give you one last piece here too. And again, I'm doing it a lot today, and you do it a lot when you're jig fishing, especially in deeper water. But we talk about finding these humps or these rock piles or whatever the case may be. A lot of times you'll be sitting on a hump, or you might be sitting on a ledge that's going down, or you might be sitting on like a plateau where it edges out. What you should really do before you start going around casting is read your depth finder, right? If you could do a 3 image, do a navionics image of the structure, the layer map, do a chirp image and a down scan, right? Because what you want to see is where the highest point of that is, and then be on that highest point. So now you're casting on the drops that are on both sides to you. You'll find when you're working deeper structure, a lot of time those fish don't necessarily sit on top, but they're going to be sitting right on the outside, right on those edges. And if you could work, because if they're sitting on those edges, now they're going to be looking at what's coming towards them, because their backs are already to that ledge. So now if it's working towards them, they're more inclined to go forward away from there and hit it while you're on your retrieve coming back in. So use your electronic.
Yeah.
Enough said. All right, guys. Well, again, I think that, I definitely am looking forward to go out and trying it. I think what I'm going to do is do one of those where that's all I take, and I'm going to live and die by the jig and do it till I get it. So, but now I feel like I have a lot more confidence in where I should be throwing it and how. So I appreciate you guys coming on and, spilling a little bit of juice, but also just, giving a general pretty good layout, A to Z of jig fishing. So
Do work, son.
Yep. Hey, we can only lead you to the water. It's up to you to catch the fish.
I will make it happen.
You'll get it.
Yep.
You'll get it. Just it's one of those things, man. It's like any technique. You just got to go out and really give it a go. And if you look for those basic structure things and just really work them, you're gonna end up getting bit. And that's something too. Like a lot of guys talk about, like if you want to keep it real simple, right? Like you don't need to go out and buy 20 different colors. Black and blue, peanut butter and jelly, and green pumpkin. Those 3 colors is all you need to start with, and just get trailers that kind of match that color pattern.
Yep.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I already have. Well, I have most of the tools. I got to get a heavy rod, but I think hopefully Brian might be helping me out with that here. So, but yeah. So,
well, Brian, looks like you're giving your rods away for free.
No, I'll pay.
We're good.
Oh, he pays to play then.
All right, guys. Well, everyone, thanks again for tuning in. This has been the Bass Fishing for Noobs segment here on the Paddle and Fin podcast, where we bring you the techniques, the tricks, and the tips to help you rip more lips. Good night, everyone.
Peace.
See ya.
Thanks for tuning in to another killer episode on Paddle and Fin. Thanks for tuning in to another killer episode on Paddle.
Make note of the editing corrections here, boss.
Thanks for tuning in to another
Why
killer.
is that not running?
It's running.
Is it?
Yeah. It was running.
Oops.
Thanks for tuning in to another killer episode on Paddle and Fin. Don't forget to go check out our website at paddle, the letter N, and fin.com. Don't forget to check out the YouTube channel at Paddle and Fin. If you got a question, comment, want to hear from a future guest on a future episode, feel free to email us at paddle, the letter N, and fin at gmail.com. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Paddle and Fin on Facebook and Instagram. Shout out to our show supporters, Angler. The Angler button and app just makes for a better time on the water and creates a virtual logbook for every fishing outing out on the water. Shout out to Rocktown Adventures, located in northern Illinois, for all your kayaking, camping, and hiking needs. Shout out to Jig Masters Jigs. When in doubt, get the jig out. Go to jigmasters.com